Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds, and welcome back to the Narnia retrospectives, and to, in fact, my favourite of the Narnia retrospectives because it focuses on my favourite book from the series. This is book number 6, the penultimate in the entire series. This is The Silver Chair, and it's interesting because this was my introduction to the series. I read the Narnia books all out of whack. I read them all out of sequence, and I came to The Silver Chair first. And the thing about The Silver Chair is that you can do that. It does feature characters that have been in the stories before. Eustace Scrubb is now the protagonist alongside a new character named Jill Pole, who is a sort of, not I wouldn't say she's a friend, she's more like an acquaintance of his from the horrible, horrible, horrible English boarding school that they're attending. And they end up swept into Narnia to have adventures and whatnot. What I love about The Silver Chair, not only is it my introduction to the series, but it's the purest, purest, purest of the books, alongside The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is cool because it comes directly after The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So you get these two very pure stories before the fallout of the last battle, which is book 7, and that one will be very interesting. I assure you, that one will be very interesting. But yeah, the Silver Chair. The Silver Chair, what I mean by purity, as I've mentioned before, what I mean is that the book is largely absent of Lewis's agenda, or whatever ideological leanings or influences are here are naturally parts of the story. They're not overbearing, they're not overweening, and I really like that. He takes his sort of biblical imagery, his Christianity, and he uses it to inform the story naturally and the mythos that underpins the story naturally, rather than hammering it in or trying to subvert the story to make it fit. Which is what he does in The Horse and His Boy, to a lesser extent in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and in The Magician's Nephew. Here, it all feels natural, it all works. The structure of the story I really, really love. So, you have this setup where Eustace has returned to the boarding school after his adventures in Narnia, and everybody knows he's different. Everybody can tell, the teachers, the bullies of the school, everybody can tell that he's different. And he is, at the beginning of the story, he is hiding from a particular group of bullies who are chasing Jill Pole, who find her name very amusing by all accounts. And he sort of rescues her, I suppose. He kind of leads her into a hiding place where she comments what happened to him. Everyone knows that he's a different guy. He's a different person. And he kind of tells her, he says that I went to this world. I went to this other place and it changed me completely. And they end up running away from the bullies again, and they end up in a sort of abandoned garden behind the school where there's a broken down brick lintel of an old shed or something that's locked. They can't get through. And the door opens of its own accord, and the view through it transforms. It changes into Narnia. And they step through. They end up in... I don't think they end up in Narnia initially. The place where they end up, it's hard to tell exactly where it is, but it's somewhere... It's in the world that Narnia inhabits, but it's not in Narnia itself, because Narnia is a specific country. And it's a sort of like island. It's almost like an abandoned island. And in an odd, bizarre twist... Jill and Eustace end up on the edge of a cliff where Jill is messing about, and Eustace tries to stop her going over the edge and ends up going over the edge himself. However, Aslan is as ever on hand to sort of make sure that he doesn't plummet into the sea and die. He's sort of breathes at Eustace, and Eustace flies off over the sea towards Narnia. And this is where you get the sort of setup of the story, and I like this too. The story is set up in a very peculiar way. Jill finds Aslan. He is sat beside a pool, and he's kind of ambiguous in this story. He's kind of threatening. He tells her that he has a task for her and for Eustace, which is why he called them through from their world. Again, one of the more objectionable elements of the Narnia stories. Aslan, an omnipotent creature that can just rewrite reality around itself, summons children from another world to do its dirty work, and places them in mortal danger when it does so. Odd, but I can sort of let it go in this one because the rest of the story is so much fun. It's so good. He gives this is the structure of the story that Aslan gives her. He gives her a series of signs that she must recognize, and when they occur, she must do something in particular. And what part of the thing that drives the story is Jill trying to remember what these signs are and how she can engage with them. She's looking for them all the time. And almost all the way through, she fails. Almost all the way through, she notices the signs in retrospect. She notices what they were and then can't do anything about them and ends up kind of desolate as a result. But that's what drives the story. That's what actually brings her and Eustace to their ultimate destination. Ultimately, they have to find a missing prince, the missing Prince Rilian of Narnia, who is the son of King Caspian. And Caspian is ancient now. I mean, it's only been like maybe a week or so since Eustace had his adventures on the Dawn Treader. But in Narnia, it's been almost half a century, and Eustace is now, Caspian is now a very old man indeed. And his son went missing some years ago, trying to find the serpent that apparently killed his mother, which is kind of interesting. Some enchanted creature, some serpent, murdered his mother, and Rilian is trying to find it, but of course ends up going missing himself. And that's their purpose. They have to find the missing Prince Rilian and bring him back, and everything will be well in Narnia. So that's what they do. They set off to find this missing prince, along with a character who is probably one of my favourites in all of the Narnia stories, Puddleglum. The brilliantly named Puddleglum, who is a creature called a Marshwiggle. And the Marshwiggles are sort of like frogmen. They are these mire-lurking, swamp-dwelling frogmen who are kind of slimy and kind of weird. And their shtick, their whole demeanour, their entire culture is based around pessimism. So Puddleglum is constantly moaning. He's a particularly British character, and that's something I really like about him. He is particularly British in the sense that he whinges about everything. He just moans and moans and moans and always looks on the dark side of things. He's always talking about how if they encounter a bridge or whatever, oh, it may be a trap, oh, it may collapse, oh, it looks very old. You know, he's that kind of guy. When they first encounter him, one of the first things he says to them is, has there been a plague of dragons, or is there a flood? Is the king well, or is he sick? You know, it's all of this sort of pessimistic stuff. But what's really funny about Puddleglum, and it's actually one of Lewis's better comedic characters as well, in the sense that the reason he goes on the journey with them is because the other Marshwiggles, apparently, as Marshwiggles go, he's quite a funny guy. He's kind of a flighty guy. Despite his pessimism, he is actually one of the more pleasant and optimistic Marshwiggles, which gives you a real indication of what the rest of them are like, because he is such a wet blanket. As the characters call him, they consistently call him a wet blanket, because he is constantly moaning and looking on the negative side of things, and it's actually really funny. I've got to say, it's really funny. He's very well characterised. He's one of the most well characterised tertiary characters, alongside the likes of Mr. Tumnus and Reapercheap in previous books. He is really, really specific. He's got a very specific tone. He speaks in a specific way, and he's fun. He's fun to be around because you just never know what's going to come out of his mouth, only that it's going to be inventively pessimistic. And that makes him loads and loads of fun. He's a great contrast to Eustace and to Jill. Both of them, at the beginning anyway, are very optimistic about being in Narnia. They find it loads of fun and interesting and engaging, especially Eustace, who's been there before. And the story, the adventure itself is wonderful. It's got this sort of like Lord of the Rings quality. It's like the earlier segments of the Lord of the Rings, or like the earlier segments of The Hobbit, where the characters are just tromping along these great plains and wending their ways over hills and mountains and having adventures. They encounter giants and all sorts of things. It's lots of fun. There is a great sequence, actually, a really great sequence early on, where they come to a place called Ettinsmoor. And as anyone knows, Etin is an old word for giant. And Ettinsmoor, they're wandering past this sort of like cliff And as they're walking, Jill has a moment because she sees what this configuration of rocks on top of the cliffs that doesn't look quite right. It doesn't look quite right, and it's actually really well drawn. Lewis develops tension really, really well in this book. She talks about how you could almost imagine that's a head, and those things on the side could be ears, and then it starts moving, obviously. And it is actually a sleeping giant, and there are hundreds of them ranged across the cliffs. It's really good. It's a good, fun sequence. Later on, they encounter, and it's, you know who it is. You know that it's going to be the villain of this book. They meet a lady on horseback with a silent rider, and the lady is dressed in green, and she is very like. The way she's described is very, very, very like the characters from Charn, the dead world that Jardis the White Witch came from. There is a sense that she is maybe of the same ilk. She could even be sort of like a descendant of the White Witch somehow. You know she's a villain because she's too nice. She's way, way, way too nice and charming. She does that whole thing that the White Witch does where she's tempting and she tries to coax the children who are footsore and weary and cold at this point with promises of hot baths and warm food and shelter, if they go and visit a particular city, the city of Harfang, which is a city of giants. But these giants, she proclaims, are civilized. They are pleasant, nice, hospitable people. And so they say, against Puddleglum's wishes, by the way. Puddleglum does not want them to go. He wants them to stick to the journey. And he doesn't trust this woman at all. He just doesn't trust her. And he's quite right. He's quite right. She is the villain of the piece. They head off to Harfang, and yeah, the giants seem to be very welcoming. They seem to be very welcoming indeed. But they're also they're kind of quietly threatening. There is this undercurrent where the giants keep saying things that are strange, that are like, oh yeah, what's going on here? There is some sort of conspiracy sort of thing going on here. And of course, it turns out that they eat people, basically. They eat human beings. Human beings are considered to be a delicacy in Harfang, and they form a particular centerpiece for an event that's coming up, which is the Autumn Feast. So, of course, the children and Puddleglum have to get away from them. What I love about the sequence in Harfang is that it's not only very well drawn, there's great tension built up, and you know something's going to kick off. You know there's something wrong here, because again, the giants are way too nice. They're way too nice to the children, and it's like, yeah, it's slightly odd. But there's this wonderful sequence where one of the signs that Aslan gave to Jill was that at a point in her journey, she would find writing amongst some stones, and she must do what that writing says. And as she's in her room in Harfang, looking down upon the ruins of an ancient giant city, she sees spelled out massive, massive words. She sees the words "under me." It's really strange. It's kind of creepy and weird the way it's framed. And the characters, all of them are like, what could that mean? Under me? What does that mean? And they do eventually find out that it means that the city goes underground. There's more of the giant city that's actually underneath the ground. And that's where they end up. That's ultimately where they end up. Actually, while they're in Harfang, because Jill forgets the signs, she has a problem remembering them. And there's quite a horrible sequence, actually, where Aslan sort of visits her with nightmares, and she's kind of distressed and frightened because she's forgotten, and she's afraid that Aslan's going to punish her and whatnot. And it's kind of like, okay, that's weird. That's a little strange and a little creepy. It's a cool sequence, but it calls into question Aslan's morality quite significantly. He's basically psychologically torturing this little girl for not doing what he says, and it's a little bit kind of, okay, do it yourself, you omnipotent wanker, do it yourself. But yeah, eventually they do end up in this city under the ground, and they end up meeting these odd creatures who are like underground men. They're from some other reality, by all accounts. They sort of worn their way through from some other state of being, and what they're doing is creating these vast earthworks throughout underneath Narnia. They're burrowing underneath Narnia, and they are multiplying and getting ready their engines of war so they can burst up from underneath and claim Narnia for themselves. And of course, leading them is this lady, the Green Lady, who is, it turns out, a witch. She is also the serpent that killed Rillian's mother. They encounter a very strange, another great sequence in this book, another great sequence. There is a man who he kind of leads the Under-Earth men, but at the same time he's almost like a prisoner of them, and they end up being his guest at a table, and he is really strange. He's really threatening, very dreamy and nightmarish and ambiguous. He's an odd guy. There's something wrong with him. You can tell from the writing there's something very wrong with him. And as it turns out, he is under an enchantment. Every night he is bound to this device, this magical device called the Silver Chair, which fuels the enchantment that keeps him lost to himself. And of course it turns out that this guy is Prince Rillian, and he is under the enchantment of the Silver Chair and has forgotten himself. As a result of the witch's influence. And of course the children and Puddleglum end up freeing him, and they end up encountering the witch, who turns into a big sort of green snake, and Rillian kills her, and they end up going back to Narnia. And at the very, very, very end of the book, it's kind of sad, because Caspian sadly does die of old age before they get back. He doesn't get to see Rillian again, which is very sad, but Rillian ends up taking the throne of Narnia, becoming the next king, and so on and so forth. And Jill and Eustace end up meeting Aslan again, who turns up at the end of everything, as he always does when all the dirty work has been done. And he ends up taking them home. And interestingly, Caspian goes with them. Caspian as a ghost, not a ghost, but as a reincarnation, I suppose, ends up going with them, and they end up frightening off the bullies and whatnot. It's slightly weird, that sequence, I will say. It is slightly weird. I mean, the setup of the book, it's almost as though Aslan put them through that trauma so that they would have the context to be able to deal with the bullies. He says to them, remember, it is children you face, not warriors, or something like that. And it's a bit like, well, I think they went through a little bit more than that, Aslan. I can't imagine that schoolyard bullies are really going to be that significant to them anymore. But it's a cool story. It's well put together. It's well wrapped up. It's fun to read. It has great sequences in it. Some of the best sequences in the Narnia books, for my money. And it has this wonderful atmosphere throughout, this slightly dour, slightly dark atmosphere, which I really, really like. And Puddleglum is my favourite character in the entire series. I really like Puddleglum. The BBC adaptation is well worth your time. The BBC adaptation of The Silver Chair, for my money, is the best of the adaptations. It's got Tom Baker as Puddleglum, for one thing, and it's worth watching for that alone. He is fantastic. He is absolutely bloody perfect as Puddleglum. And there's some really ambitious sequences in it, because of course they've got to do the giants in Harfang, so they use lots of camera trickery to make them look gigantic, and it works really well. There is this definite sense of atmosphere in the BBC adaptation. There are some hokey moments, like when the Queen becomes the giant snake. It's just a giant puppet, and it's really quite poor, to be honest. But beyond that, it's a very, very good adaptation. And it's really sad to me that they never went on to do the big budget version. The big budget films stopped with The Dawn Treader, and The Dawn Treader is shit. It's a terrible, terrible film. But it would have been nice to see what they did with The Silver Chair. I think it would lend itself to a filmic adaptation really well. I think it would work very well indeed. Slightly out of fashion now, because it technically should have come on the tail end of the things like The Lord of the Rings and the Harry Potter series and so on and so forth. But I think it would still work well. I think it would still be fairly decent. I would like to see a new adaptation. But yeah, that was The Silver Chair, and I'm glad that this one is on a high note. I'm glad this one is enthusiastic, because the next one, The Last Battle, the next one is the one that basically makes a lot of people who read the Chronicles of Narnia when they were kids turn against it completely. That's what that book is. So, when we come back, ladies and gents, The Last Battle.